The bustling trading station, Nebula Spire, was a chaotic blend of lights, sounds, and smells. Merchants of all species hawked their goods, holographic advertisements flickered overhead, and travelers from across the galaxy hurried about their business. Amid the noise, David sat on a bench in the promenade, unwrapping his lunch, a simple sandwich he picked up from the human food kiosk. As he bit into his meal, his eyes wandered across the crowded walkway. That's when he noticed her. She was huddled in a shadowed corner, trying to make herself invisible. Her thin, delicate frame looked like it hadn't known a proper meal in weeks. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale blue that seemed to glow under the station's artificial lights. Her large violet eyes darted nervously, scanning every passerby, as if expecting trouble. David hesitated, sandwich in hand. He didn't recognize her species, but it was clear she needed help. Most people walked past her without a second glance, some muttering in disgust. David wasn't like most people. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and approached her slowly. She stiffened, her violet eyes locking onto him with a mix of fear and caution. "Hey," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "You okay?" She didn't answer, her gaze flickering to his sandwich and then away, as if ashamed. David followed her glance and held the sandwich out to her. "Here, you look like you could use this more than I can." The alien woman hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "Why?" she whispered, her voice faint and melodic, but heavy with distrust. David shrugged, offering a small smile. "Because you're hungry, and no one should go hungry." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment she seemed frozen. Then, as if a dam had broken, she reached out with delicate, clawed fingers and took the sandwich. Her hand shook as she brought it to her mouth and took a small bite. The moment the food touched her tongue, tears streamed down her cheeks, silent but overwhelming. David sat back, giving her space as she ate. She devoured the sandwich in minutes, her tears flowing freely. When she finally looked up, her voice cracked as she said, "Thank you, thank you." "What's your name?" David asked gently. "Corinne," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm David," he said, leaning against the wall. "Looks like you've had it rough." Corinne nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that words couldn't express. I've been running, hiding. My people, we've lost everything." David's brow furrowed. He wanted to ask more, but Corinne seemed too fragile to dive into her story just yet. For now, he decided, offering her safety and kindness would be enough. Little did he know, this small act of compassion was the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would change both their lives forever. David watched as Corinne wiped her eyes, her trembling hands clutching the empty sandwich wrapper as if it were a lifeline. Her gratitude was evident, but so was her exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the chaotic noise of Nebula Spire filling the silence between them. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" David asked softly. Corinne hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she murmured. "Not anymore." David leaned back against the cold metal wall, his mind racing. He had always been the kind of person who couldn't look away from someone in need. And now, seeing her so vulnerable, he felt a strong urge to help, though he didn't yet know how. "All right," he said finally. "We'll figure something out. For now, let's get you out of this crowd." Corinne's violet eyes widened in surprise. "Why? Why would you help me? No one else." She stopped herself, her voice faltering. David smiled faintly. "Guess I don't like seeing someone left behind. Come on." He stood and held out a hand. She hesitated again, her gaze flickering between his hand and his face, searching for any sign of malice. When she found none, she placed her delicate, clawed hand in his. It was cold, almost weightless. As they walked through the station, Corinne stayed close to David, her steps uncertain. Her frail figure drew glances, some curious, others disdainful. David noticed the way she flinched under those looks, her head lowering, as if to make herself invisible. "People can be cruel," David said, his tone gentle but firm. "But don't let them make you feel like you don't belong." Karen's lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but she stayed silent. They arrived at David's small quarters, a simple room with a narrow bed, a cluttered desk, and a kitchenette that barely qualified as functional. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and right now, safety was what Karen needed most. "You can rest here for a while," David said, motioning to the bed. "It's not fancy, but it beats sitting in a corner out there." Karen stepped inside cautiously, her posture stiff. The warmth of the room and the absence of prying eyes seemed to ease some of her tension. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one's ever cared like this before." David leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "Well, I'm not just anyone," he said with a wry grin, hoping to lighten the mood. "Besides, I'm curious about you. Where are you from?" Karen hesitated, her expression clouding with pain. "My people, the Velari. We're scattered now, almost extinct." David's chest tightened. He wanted to ask more, but seeing the weight of her words, he decided to let her rest for now. He had a feeling this was only the beginning of her story, and whatever was coming next, he was determined to stand by her. David sat at the small desk in his cramped quarters, tinkering with a broken data pad to keep his hands busy. Karen lay on the bed, her breathing steady as she rested. She had fallen asleep shortly after telling him about her people, the Velari, and the tragedy that had almost wiped them out. David couldn't stop thinking about her story, an entire species nearly extinct, forced into hiding and starvation because of fear and prejudice. It was hard to imagine how anyone could survive under those conditions. Yet here she was, fragile but still standing. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the room, startling both David and Karen. She bolted upright, her violet eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," David said quickly, motioning for her to stay put. "I'll handle it." When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with two towering figures. They were traders from one of the more aggressive species on the station, their rough scales glinting under the corridor lights. One of them sneered, showing a row of sharp teeth. "You're the human, right?" the first one growled, his voice low and threatening. "The one who gave food to that Velari scum." David's jaw tightened. He didn't like where this was going. "What's it to you?" he replied, keeping his tone calm but firm. The second trader stepped closer, his bulk filling the doorway. "She's bad luck. Everyone knows it. The Velari bring nothing but trouble. You'd better kick her out before the whole station turns on you." David's eyes narrowed. "Bad luck? That's ridiculous. She's just a person trying to survive." The first trader leaned in, his breath foul. "This is your only warning, human. Get rid of her, or you'll regret it." David didn't flinch. "Get out of here," he said firmly, his voice steady. "I don't care about your superstitions. She's not going anywhere." For a moment, it looked like the traders might force their way in. But after a tense standoff, they backed off, muttering curses under their breath as they walked away. David closed the door and turned to Karen. She was standing by the bed, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression filled with guilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to bring you trouble. I can leave if—" "No," David interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're not going anywhere. They're the problem, not you." Karen's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. For the first time in a long while, someone was standing up for her, and it felt both comforting and overwhelming. David sat down on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. "Looks like helping you might make me some enemies," he said with a wry smile. "But I've made worse decisions in my life." Karen managed a small, shaky smile. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. The station's promenade buzzed with activity, but David and Karen moved carefully, staying close to the quieter corridors. Since the confrontation with the traitors, David had become more cautious. Karen kept her hood up, her slender frame hunched to avoid drawing attention. "Are you sure about this?" Karen asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the station's machinery. David glanced at her and nodded. "We need to know more about your people. If we can figure out what happened, maybe we can find a way to help." Karen hesitated but didn't argue. She had spent so long running, hiding from the galaxy's indifference and cruelty, that the idea of someone helping her felt foreign. Yet David's determination gave her a fragile sense of hope. They arrived at a small, dimly lit data terminal tucked away in a less frequented part of the station. David set to work, his fingers flying over the console as he accessed the station's restricted archives. The system resisted, throwing up layers of encryption, but David was a skilled engineer, and the station's outdated systems were no match for him. "Almost there," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Just need to bypass one more." "Got it." Karen leaned closer as a stream of ancient data scrolled across the screen. It was a mix of old reports, trade logs, and encrypted files labeled Velari artifacts. One file caught their attention. Sector Zeta, Artifact Storage. David clicked on it, and a grainy map of the station appeared, highlighting a long-forgotten section buried deep within the structure. The description mentioned advanced technology confiscated after the fall of the Velari homeworld. Karen's breath hitched. "That's it," she whispered. "The relics. If one of them is still intact, it might help my people." David turned to her, his expression serious. "What do these relics do?" "They're part of our legacy," Karen explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "Each one holds pieces of our knowledge, our history. Some say they were designed to guide us if we ever lost our way." David nodded, his mind already working out a plan. "Then we'll get to Sector Zeta and see if we can find one. But it won't be easy." He was right. According to the file, Sector Zeta had been repurposed by a corporate syndicate known for its ruthless practices. The relics were likely stored in a vault, heavily guarded and off-limits to anyone without clearance. Karen's shoulders slumped. "It's too dangerous. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," David interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm offering. You deserve a chance, and so do your people." Karen stared at him, her violet eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." David smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet. We haven't even started." As they left the terminal, both of them knew the path ahead would be perilous. But for the first time, Karen felt like she wasn't facing it alone. David adjusted the straps of his satchel, feeling the comforting weight of his toolkit inside. He glanced at Karen, who stood beside him in the dimly lit corridor, her hood pulled low over her face. Her nerves were evident in the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her cloak. "Ready?" he asked softly. Karen nodded, though her expression betrayed her uncertainty. "As ready as I'll ever be." Their destination was Sector Zeta, a long-abandoned part of Nebula Spire that the Syndicate had repurposed into a storage facility. Few ventured there, as the Syndicate had a reputation for dealing harshly with trespassers. But that didn't deter David. If the relics could provide a future for Karen and her people, he was willing to take the risk. The two moved quickly, weaving through lesser-used corridors to avoid attention. The further they went, the quieter the station became. The lively hum of the promenade was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional hiss of steam or the hum of ancient machinery. When they reached the access hatch leading to Sector Zeta, David crouched beside it and pulled out his toolkit. "This lock looks complicated," he murmured, studying the control panel. "Give me a minute." Karen crouched beside him, glancing nervously down the corridor. "What happens if we're caught?" David flashed her a grin. "Let's not find out." With deft hands, he pried open the panel and began rewiring the circuits. Sparks flew as the system protested, but David's confidence never wavered. After a tense few minutes, the hatch slid open with a hiss. "See. Easy," he said, stepping back and motioning for Karen to follow. She gave him a small, grateful smile before slipping through the opening. Inside, Sector Zeta was a stark contrast to the rest of the station. The air was stale, the walls lined with dust-covered crates and flickering lights. It was clear this section hadn't been designed for visitors. Karen paused, her gaze locking onto a large door at the end of the corridor. "It's there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. David followed her gaze and nodded. "Let's move." As they approached, the door's biometric scanner came into view. It glowed menacingly, a clear sign that unauthorized access wouldn't go unnoticed. David knelt beside the panel, pulling out a small device from his satchel. "This might take a while," he said, connecting the device to the scanner. "Keep an eye out." Karen nodded, her eyes darting nervously down the corridor. Every creak and groan of the station seemed louder in the oppressive silence. Minutes felt like hours as David worked, sweat beading on his forehead. Just as he managed to bypass the lock, a sharp noise echoed from behind them. A heavy footstep. "David," Karen whispered urgently. The door slid open just as a group of armed syndicate guards rounded the corner. David grabbed Karen's hand, pulling her inside. "Run," he shouted as alarms began to blare, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The door slammed shut behind them with a metallic thud as David and Karen dashed into the darkened room. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder by the second. David's heart raced, but he didn't stop running. They had seconds before the syndicate guards would be on them. "Where do we go now?" Karen gasped, her voice full of panic. David scanned the room quickly. It was a large storage facility, filled with crates, old equipment, and crates piled high, creating a maze of obstacles. There was no obvious exit. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. "Over there," he pointed to a narrow corridor at the back of the room. It was barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through, but it was their best chance. "Come on." They bolted toward the opening, ducking behind crates to avoid detection. But just as they neared the corridor, a bright light swept through the room, followed by a voice over the loudspeakers. "All units report to Sector Zeta. Intruders detected. Capture on site." David's stomach sank. They didn't have much time before the guards would flood in from every direction. "We can't stay here," Karen whispered urgently. "I know," David replied. He grabbed her hand again, pulling her toward the narrow corridor. "This way. We'll use the shadows to stay hidden." They squeezed into the tight space, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. The corridor twisted and turned, offering a temporary escape from the chaos unfolding behind them. But even in the relative safety of the narrow passage, David knew they weren't out of danger. The syndicate was ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to capture them. Karen's breath was ragged as she clung to David's side, her face pale with fear. "We're not going to make it out, are we?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David glanced at her, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't say that. We'll find a way." But even as he spoke, doubt began to creep into his mind. They had no backup, no plan beyond this escape. They were two people against a heavily armed syndicate force. They had already been lucky to get this far. They rounded a corner, only to be confronted by a locked metal door. David immediately started working on the panel, his hands moving quickly but with purpose. Karen stood behind him, her eyes darting nervously, listening for any sound of footsteps approaching. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed from behind them. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and a shout rang out. "They're in the west corridor. Move fast." David's hands froze on the panel. His mind raced. If they didn't get through this door, they were done for. He pulled out his toolkit, desperately trying to force open the lock, but it wouldn't budge. They were running out of time. "We're almost there," he said, his voice strained. "Just hold on." Karen's gaze was wide with fear, but she nodded, gripping his arm tightly. As the sound of the guards grew closer, David made one last effort. With a sharp twist of his tool, the lock gave way with a satisfying click. The door slid open, revealing another long hallway. "Go," David shouted. They ran again, adrenaline pumping in their veins as they pushed their bodies to the limit. Every step brought them closer to freedom, but also closer to the danger that pursued them. The hallway stretched out before them, long and dimly lit. The sound of pounding footsteps behind them echoed louder with each passing second. David didn't dare look back. His focus was entirely on the path ahead. He could hear Karen's breathing behind him, quick and panicked. She was struggling to keep up, her thin frame exhausted from their frantic escape. "We can't keep running like this," David muttered, glancing at her. "We need to find somewhere to hide, or we're finished." Karen nodded, but there was a look of dread in her eyes. "The syndicate will catch us. There's nowhere safe left." David's mind raced as they turned a corner and came face to face with a locked metal door. He was about to start working on it when the sound of a voice cut through the air. "This is the last chance. Surrender now, and we won't have to use force." David's heart skipped a beat. He glanced around, searching for an escape. To the left, there was a narrow ventilation shaft, but it was too small for both of them. "We need to make a choice, now," David hissed, motioning to the vent. "You go through it. I'll hold them off." "No," Karen gasped, shaking her head. "I can't leave you." David placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "You don't have a choice. You have to get to the relic. You're the only one who can help your people." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but David didn't give her the chance. He turned to the vent and began working quickly to loosen the cover. As the door at the other end of the hall slid open, the first of the syndicate guards came into view. "Go," David shouted. Karen hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. She slipped into the ventilation shaft, disappearing from view just as the guards rushed forward, their boots ringing on the metal floor. David wasted no time. He grabbed a nearby piece of scrap metal and threw it down the hall, creating a loud noise to distract the guards. It worked, just long enough for him to dart into a nearby maintenance room. The door slammed shut behind him with a soft hiss, and he quickly locked it. His pulse raced as he listened to the guards' voices outside the door, too close for comfort. He had bought Karen a little time, but now he was trapped. He could only hope she'd make it to the relics without him. Minutes passed in silence. David kept low, listening intently. He heard the guards move away, their voices fading down the hall. Slowly, he stood and peeked through a crack in the door. They were gone. He exhaled slowly, his mind still racing. He had to get back to Karen, and he had to do it fast. He couldn't let the syndicate stop her, not when she was so close to saving her people. With no time to waste, David moved quickly, retracing their steps to the storage facility. He needed to find Karen and help her activate the relic. That was the only hope they had now. David's footsteps echoed in the quiet corridors as he made his way back toward the heart of Nebula Spire. Every part of him screamed to find Karen, to make sure she was safe. He had no idea where she'd gone after slipping through the vent, but he couldn't stop now. The relics, the hope for her people, depended on her reaching them. He retraced the route they had taken, moving swiftly and quietly. The station had become a maze in his mind, but the urgency in his chest kept him focused. His heart beat in time with his footsteps. He had to find her, and he had to do it before the syndicate closed in. After what felt like an eternity of running through abandoned hallways and hidden access tunnels, David finally reached the storage facility again. The doors were still open, and he could hear the faint hum of machinery from within. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the dark room for any sign of Karen. "Karen," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you here?" The silence that followed was unnerving. He waited, but there was no answer. His heart pounded harder, and for a moment, he thought about turning back, until he spotted a faint glow in the far corner of the room. He moved toward it, each step slow and deliberate. As he neared, he saw Karen standing before one of the vaults, her hands shaking as she touched the ancient symbols on the door. The relic's energy was pulsing, faint but unmistakable. She was so close. "Karen," David said, his voice filled with relief. She turned, her eyes wide. She looked exhausted, her skin pale and her hair disheveled, but there was a spark of determination in her gaze. "You made it," she whispered. I thought you'd been caught." David walked over to her, his breath heavy. "Not yet, but we don't have much time. We have to activate this relic before they come back." Karen nodded, stepping aside as David approached the vault. The symbols on the door were intricate, ancient, too complex for David to fully understand. But Karen seemed to know exactly what to do. She placed her hand on the door, and it reacted instantly. The glowing symbols shifted, and the vault slowly creaked open. Inside, the relic, a crystalline sphere, glowed with an eerie light. It was the size of a small orb, its surface etched with mysterious patterns. As Karen reached for it, she looked at David. "This is it," she said softly. "This is what can save us." David could see the hope in her eyes, but he knew their troubles weren't over. "We need to get out of here. Now." Karen hesitated, her fingers brushing against the relic's surface. "I have to activate it. I have to open the way for my people." Before David could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. The guards were back. "We don't have time," David urged, grabbing her arm. "We need to move." But Karen stood firm, her grip tightening on the relic. "This is the only chance. The Valeri have been waiting for someone to awaken this power." David's eyes darted to the entrance of the room, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder. He didn't want to force her, but they were running out of time. "We can't wait any longer," he said firmly. "Let's go." Karen finally nodded, clutching the relic tightly. Together, they turned to leave, knowing that whatever came next would shape the future of her people. The corridors of Nebula Spire had never felt more like a maze. David and Karen hurried through the twisting hallways, their footsteps quick but quiet, careful not to attract any more attention. The relic pulsed softly in Karen's hands, its glow illuminating the path ahead, but the sound of the guards' boots behind them grew louder with each passing moment. Karen's face was tense, her eyes darting around nervously. She held the relic tightly, as if it were the last thing keeping her tethered to hope. But David could feel the pressure building. The walls of the station seemed to close in around them, and every corner felt like a trap. "We're almost there," David whispered, leading the way toward the back exit. It was the fastest way out, but it was also the most dangerous. The Syndicate's mercenaries were notorious for patrolling the lower levels. Karen's voice was a quiet whisper behind him. "What happens if they catch us? The relic, it's our only hope." David didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. The Syndicate was relentless, and if they caught them now, it could be the end of everything. They would stop at nothing to take the relic from her, but he couldn't let that happen. "We just have to keep moving," David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "If we can make it to the docks, we can find a way off this station." Karen nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew she couldn't afford to fail. Not now, not when she was so close to restoring hope to her people. As they reached the exit, the faint sound of guards approaching echoed from behind them. They had no time to waste. David glanced over his shoulder, his heart pounding. "Karen, we need to hurry." Karen tightened her grip on the relic, her breathing shallow but steady. "I can't just leave it behind. I can't." "We don't have a choice," David interrupted, pulling her toward the exit. "If we don't get to the ship, we're both dead." Karen hesitated for a second longer, then nodded. Together, they ran toward the docking bay, hoping they would make it in time. But as they turned the final corner, they came face to face with a group of Syndicate mercenaries. They stood blocking the way, their weapons drawn and ready. David froze. There was no way out now. The mercenaries were too many, and their guns were trained directly on them. He felt a cold sense of hopelessness wash over him. "You're too late," one of the mercenaries sneered, his voice dripping with menace. "Hand over the relic, and we might let you go." Karen's fingers tightened around the relic. "You won't take it from me," she said, her voice shaking, but filled with quiet strength. David's mind raced. There had to be another way out. He couldn't let them take her. He couldn't let them take the relic. Without warning, he stepped in front of Karen, his stance protective. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. The mercenaries chuckled, clearly underestimating him. But David wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when they were so close. Karen's hand slid to his shoulder, her touch light, but reassuring. "We're not finished yet," she whispered. David met her eyes, determined. They would find a way out of this, together. The mercenaries stood in front of them, their weapons aimed with cold precision. David could feel his heart thudding in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence that had settled over the docking bay. He stepped forward, trying to hide the tremor in his legs. He wasn't a soldier, but he was something else, a human who wouldn't back down when someone needed help. "You're really going to do this?" one of the mercenaries taunted, his voice full of scorn. He took a step closer, aiming his weapon directly at David. "You think you can stop us?" David didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the mercenaries, refusing to show fear. Behind him, Corinne was quiet, but he could feel the weight of her presence, the relic still pulsing in her hands. "I'm not going to let you take her," David said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. Karen's grip tightened around the relic, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The air felt charged, heavy with the knowledge that whatever happened next would change everything. Then, in the blink of an eye, Karen stepped forward, her hands raised toward the relic. The crystal in her grasp began to glow brighter, its light filling the room, brighter than any light David had ever seen. The mercenaries staggered back, shielding their eyes as if the light was too much to bear. "Get back," one of them shouted, his voice filled with panic. But it was too late. With a sudden flash, the light exploded outward in a wave of energy. The shock wave hit the mercenaries, knocking them off their feet and sending them sprawling across the floor. David barely had time to react before he was pushed back by the force of the blast. Karen stood tall, the relic now fully activated, its energy radiating in waves around her. The mercenaries lay unconscious or stunned, unable to move. David stared at Karen, his mouth open in disbelief. "How?" he began, but Karen only looked at him, a quiet smile crossing her face. "This is the power of my people," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. "The relic, it was never just a weapon. It's a beacon, a call to my people who have been lost for so long. It's the key to saving them." David stepped forward, his eyes still wide. "So, this is it. You've activated it." Karen nodded. "It will guide them back to us. My people, the Velari. They've been scattered across the galaxy for generations, but this relic will show them the way home." David couldn't help but feel a rush of hope. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about an entire species. And in that moment, he realized that by helping her, he had helped an entire future. Karen turned toward him, her expression filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me what humanity is capable of. You've given me something I thought was lost forever. Hope." David smiled, a sense of warmth spreading through him. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I didn't do it alone. We did it together." As the last of the mercenaries were subdued, Karen's eyes glistened as she looked up at the stars visible through the docking bay windows. The future, once so uncertain, now felt full of promise. Together, they had defied the odds. Together, they had awakened a new dawn. And as Karen held the relic, David knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. A new era was starting, not just for Karen, but for humanity and the Veilari alike. The galaxy had no idea what was coming.